Howdy, hi, I'm Jon Caldara, president of the Independence Institute. You're watching Devil's Advocate. So, election time again. We'll talk about Proposition 103, but first I want to get into the Occupy Denver silliness. I loved it. It was great. From the Denver Post, Tim Hoover, who actually had his own tent out there. It was
more of a teepee.
Well, given what reporters are getting paid these days, it was good that you found some housing for the night.
It was. I mean, it's affordable housing for reporters, so
yeah.
It was more of a yurt.
We got a yurt. Joe Hanel, thank you. The Durango Herald.
Correct.
Is that still a town?
Yeah. It's probably the most prosperous town in Colorado now these days, from what I see.
Hit gold, did you?
Yeah.
All right, let's start out with Occupy Denver. Now, you spent a night down there.
Yeah, there.
Por qué?
Well, I came to see a fight, and I wound up seeing a staring contest. So there was this whole question of what's the governor going to do with this? These people were in a state park right out in front of the Capitol. It's kind of wound up on his turf, and finally on Thursday of last week, he said, "You guys can't pitch your camp down here anymore." And he didn't say what he was going to do, but he said, "You're not going to be allowed in the park." And that kind of went out as that was basically just an invitation to come brawl at the flagpole after school. So that attracted hundreds of people down here.
John Hickenlooper has done a lot of things right. He's been able to steer negotiations with the unions when he was mayor. This one, he boofed it. I'm sorry. I think he completely dropped the ball. The law is the law. It's pretty clear. You can't camp in Lincoln Park after 11. You can't be there. And if he enforced that, or if the mayor enforced that, or if the Colorado State Police enforced that, or the Denver Police enforced it on day one, there would have been no issue. There were 12 people out there the first night. It would have been gone. Am I wrong on this?
I think they realized that. I think what happened was it started out as a small encampment of...
I like that, encampment. They were there with their bazookas, M16s. It was an encampment.
A bivouac, really. It was a small group of a couple tents. No one thought too much of it. It was maybe what was seen as sort of usual suspects, tie-dyed customers with some signs. And it sort of started growing a little bit, and it was kind of growing almost exponentially, so that each new increment of growth, it seemed to get maybe double or even triple. And so by Tuesday of the following week, after it had started, the governor was interviewed publicly about it, and even kind of downplayed it and said, "Oh, it's just 8 or 10 tents." Well, I went down there after he said that, and I counted more than 40 at that time. So I think it was just blooming, and it was clear by the next day that I think it was 60 even. Just the publicity over it. There was a real kind of underground social media chatter about it.
They're hippies. Hippies like parties. I understand that. They missed Woodstock. This is what
fairness,
they wanted.
A lot of them weren't hippies. There was a group of what you might probably call hippies, folks on the left and people who are, regular protesters perhaps, though not all of them. And then what happened was something else, which was that a significant number of homeless people kind of glommed onto it, understood that, hey, they're letting people camp out here. They never let us camp out here. Now they will. And
wait, let me just jump on that statement right there. They never let us camp out here. So in other words, someone was enforcing the frickin' law before Occupy Denver came to camp on there.
Yeah, I mean, there will be people
who enforced that law before the protest happened.
The troopers. I mean, there will be people, and Denver police, there will be people who will say, well, they didn't enforce it uniformly, which may be true. Now and then you might have somebody that would spend the night in a sleeping bag in a park, and they regularly do it now. But this was different. I mean, pitching tents, a little more visible. Then they started growing, and I think what the hope was perhaps this will just fade away.
The cold weather will take care of it.
Cold weather, or just it'll peter out. People will have their say, and they'll move along, and they're not really harming anybody, But what was happening, I think, in the tent city, was that conditions were kind of worsening, and you had a
the problem in the refugee camp was that the conditions were worsening, so we needed to get the UN involved. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, we didn't see the blue helmets, but what happened was there were some real sanitation issues because there was, for lack of a better term, open air facilities.
This is the polite way of saying they pooped in the park.
Yeah.
They couldn't go across the street to the Wellington Webb Municipal Building and take a poop there. No, they had to poop in the park.
And I kind of doubt that some of those were protesters, because there were people who were going into the Capitol to use the facilities there.
Joe Hanel was there overnight, and I've always questioned your hygiene.
Several people do.
So why did the State Patrol enforce the law before this? Homeless people get kicked out. You're not allowed to be in that park. And then on day one, they didn't. Did they get an order? Did somebody say leave them alone, or was that the police decision?
Now, this park was not like a model of Western civilization before this thing began. This park is a notorious spot for drug dealing. This is right at the corner of Broadway and Colfax. There used to be bus shelters there, and Denver Police and RTD ripped them out this summer because there was so much drug dealing going on in the bus shelters. And there are police surveillance cameras
Ever
there.
since Fast Tracks blew it, RTD has been looking for ways to get money.
If they could have just slapped a little tax on that, and it probably would have worked. Yeah. Well, I mean, I work out of the Capitol building. I've noticed that there's some, ever since they ripped those shelters out, there's some kind of sketchy characters that tend to hang out a little deeper into the park underneath the cover of the trees. Well, Occupy Denver goes and pitches their camp basically right on drug dealer territory, and those guys didn't go anywhere. And that
what guys didn't go anywhere?
The
dealers.
Drug dealers, yeah. There was a lot of that going on in the camp.
Well, then, again, you're not the governor, so I'm not accusing you. But if there were drug dealers, and there were people staying there, cops have patrolled that before. Arrests have been made on that property before. I can't imagine they haven't. And when the governor went on Mike Rosen show and said, we just don't know really who has jurisdiction. How is it that the day before, the cops seem to know who has jurisdiction?
Actually,
and the day after they did?
Actually, you bring up an important issue. If you're talking about just rousting, a small group of homeless people or individual homeless people, the patrol might do it, or Denver police might do it. Doesn't always happen. Sometimes people get away with it, whatever. But I mean, but this was a different situation. Then the question became, as it had obviously clearly grown, mushroomed into size, significant area, there were going to have to be potentially mass arrests. Okay, so you might have to arrest 30, 40, 50.
But only because they waited so long.
Perhaps, but here's the issue that came out of that, which is the Denver District Attorney's Office only takes cases for misdemeanors that are presented by Denver police. So in other words, if the State Patrol arrests someone on a state misdemeanor, they have to run that through Denver police for them to move it on to the DA's office. So what that meant then is that if a bunch of people were going to get arrested, they had to have the city on board to do this. And the city was not super willing initially to take this up.
When you say the city, we're all the city. We're all the city. Who in the city was not willing to do it?
Specifically, I can't say
Denver
who, but
police?
I will tell you, not so much the police as the administration. And so
Hancock.
Sure, his administration. I can't say him personally.
Why not?
Because we don't know.
Okay, we don't know what he knew and when he knew it, but
exactly. The point is that there was some concern that, well, look, the city just came off of, a bunch of lawsuits that resulted out of these arrests during the DNC. How much do we really want to engage in this? Might this just blow over? How isn't this sort of possibly a state problem? You know, what do we really need to do? Well, this went on for a day or two, and this was right at the apex of the growth of that tent city. So it just kept growing and growing and growing while people were chatting about what to do. And by Wednesday, they had kind of gotten the city on board. It was that evening.
You know, as a taxpayer, it's frustrating to see laws being selectively enforced. And it seemed like there was a real void of leadership, both with the governor and with the mayor on this. And I hope they learn from it. If they took care of it right away, it would cost less. You would have had a night of sleep instead of waiting for the billy clubs to hit skulls. You were there the night that they cleared.
And the billy clubs never really hit the skulls. So
what happened that night? The cops did a really good job, didn't they?
It's very interesting what happened that night. And I know there's a lot of criticism of what the governor did leading up to this, but he definitely hired well in his cabinet for these security positions in public safety, because they came up with this plan that was, it used kind of fatigue and paranoia to just chase people out of the park. And
how so?
Well, the park closed at 11 o'clock.
So and all the reporters were waiting there, wanting the fire hoses to be going at 101.
I mean, I had a bandana and vinegar ready to go to combat the tear gas and everything that I was just sure was going to be flowing. There were probably 1,000 people that came down there, were in that park that day, way bigger than the crowds had been.
And they came down itching for a fight, didn't they? I mean,
several of them did. Some of them were several of them came to just be there and show support, and people were saying, they tell me to leave, I'm going to leave. And then some came for a fight. Some people were, I mean, there were some clearly fairly disturbed people there, a couple of them. One vet, Iraq vet, was down there, clearly a bad case of PTSD, just shouting, and I mean, I thought his throat was going to burst. He was yelling at the cops so much.
How did the cops handle it? The video I saw was impressive.
Yes. So they had this deadline at 11 o'clock. You've got to be out of the park. That's when it closes. Everybody in the park after then, subject to arrest. So some people leave at 11, not too many. The rumor goes around that the cops are coming in at 2 o'clock. I don't know who started that rumor. I wouldn't all be surprised if it was the police themselves. And 2 o'clock comes around, the crowd hangs out till 2 and nothing happens. A few more people dwindle away. 2:30, the police start coming around and making announcements on loudspeakers. This park's closed, you gotta go. We're coming in at 3:15. They do that several times. I'm, in the park thinking, tear gas starts flying.
Gotta stay up for another hour.
Yeah, I gotta stay up for another hour, and then I've gotta run across the street here. Right. 3:15 comes around, and sure enough, the police do come in. There's a parking garage across from the park diagonally, and the police had surrounded the park with squad cars, and then out of that parking garage, probably 60 or 70 riot police march in, 2 by 2, march into the park. The protesters have their bullhorns, and they're, singing a Darth Vader theme, dun 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 dun. The police command post is up on the state capitol, and that gave them a huge laugh. And then the cops went in, tore down the tents, and then did nothing. Nobody got arrested. I was, cowering, terrified up on the steps of the Capitol, thinking one step across the security line and I could be arrested too. A press pass doesn't get you anything. But finally I was hanging out with a radio reporter, and after about an hour we decided they're not arresting anybody, let's go in there. So we just kind of hung out there for the rest of the night. And what the cops were doing was just, every time they saw a little bit of an opening, they would move their line up a little bit, just a couple of steps. And just almost imperceptibly, by dawn, the park was clear, and they were just all out on the sidewalk. And there were just 3 big tents left, and protesters formed this human chain around one of their tents. That was where their Alamo. And cops said, they kept coming in, you've got to take this tent down, you've got to take this tent down. Well, by that time, I'd been awake for 24 hours. I'd been standing in the cold for like 9 hours. I thought, they've been threatening this all night. I'm going home. Well, 5-10 minutes later, they start arresting people. So I missed the only action in the night. But
they only arrested about a dozen or 25.
2 dozen.
Yeah. No big deal.
Yeah, no big deal.
It seems as though the cops handled this masterfully, and also knowing
that
you live in an age where everybody's carrying a video camera in their pocket as part of their cell phone. You know, they needed to be careful not to bite on any of the insults.
But one thing I think that's really important to point out that may not be well known is that a contingent of the protest organizers who are maybe a little bit more level-headed, they were working with Hickenlooper's office for most of the week. And it was through that interaction that a lot of this was sort of arranged. Hickenlooper was getting a ton of blame for not having acted sooner. But
is that unfair?
Perhaps not. But when he acted, there was very little praise from Republican quarters for how he handled it, except from one person, the state's highest law enforcement officer, Jon Caldara, who said that Hickenlooper performed magnificently. He was involved in the plan, he knew what was going on, and essentially by using restraint, common sense, and more restraint and tactics, they cleared the park. And I remember the chief of the patrol said, we asked ourselves, look, what was the goal? Was the goal to make a bunch of arrests, or was it to clear and secure the park?
Well, let me join in that praise. I think the maneuver, or however you want to take it, was done very well, done in a very measured way. But let me give most of the credit to the street cops who have to, hold themselves still while they're being yelled at and baited into some sort of confrontation. But I still let me ask you, the big lesson here for me is, if something like this happens, when you enforce the law right away, it prevents a lot of other laws from being broken. It's Giuliani and the broken window theory. Enforce the small laws, and the big ones won't happen. What's the big lesson? Before we move on to a different topic, what's the big lesson, the big takeaway? What did Denver learn? What did the mayor and the governor learn?
It's a good question.
I only ask good questions.
Yeah, I know. And I'm not sure what they're going to say that their lesson is from this, but I guess you saw from the response just a couple of days later, Denver police were not taking any. They weren't giving any ground once it moved across the street, basically, to the city park there. They said no tents at all, nobody setting anything up. And on just 2 days after this, I mean, they've broken out the pepper balls like halfway through the afternoon. So the nonviolent element of it, that when State Patrol was in charge, that Denver police weren't quite as patient with things.
What's the big takeaway?
Well, I think Hickenlooper learned a very sanguine lesson about inaction, but he recovered really well, and I think he got a lot of credit for that. What strikes me as an amazing irony about all this is this the governor of a state, and he basically his crisis, his most public and agitated crisis so far, was essentially clearing a park in downtown Denver, which he managed to completely escape that sort of crisis as mayor of Denver. I mean, yeah, there were protests at the DNC, but that never really sort of landed on Hickenlooper's doorstep as a symbolic of his.
That's what surprised me the most, was thinking, and Hickenlooper did a fine job. And listen, I don't like complimenting Democrats. It's not in my nature. But the DNC went off very smoothly, and I think Hickenlooper had a large role to do with that. I would think then that he would say, now that we've learned that, you can't let protesters break the law. We learned that with the DNC, and I think he waited way too long, and he caused this crisis because of his inaction. I think that's the lesson that'll take away, and I don't think it'll happen again. He's smart enough for that.
Yeah. Well, and one other thing that he benefited from here is the protesters themselves. At its core, they said they are devoted to nonviolence. A lot of people did arrive looking for a fight, and it was the group, the inner group that really kept that from happening. I talked about the Iraq vet that I thought was going to come unhinged. People kind of came and restrained him and talked him off the ledge. You know, this is not Latin America. This is not Greece. This is
tasering somebody is not talking them off the ledge.
Right. No, they just tapped him on the shoulder.
We're running out of time. I want to get to the biggest election issue this year that nobody seems to know about, which is Proposition 103. Proposition 103 is Rollie Heath's 8% tax increase on income tax, and also a little tax increase on state sales tax, to go to education for 5 years, and then who knows what after. This is something that the governor hasn't endorsed, the chamber hasn't endorsed. Oh my God, the Denver Post didn't endorse, which, you know, I've never seen the Denver Post not endorse a tax increase of any size. What's the story or the non-story? Because I don't think people even know that there's a huge statewide election going on.
Well, the people pushing the huge statewide election issue don't have much money, so that's part of the problem. This was largely a grassroots effort. A few groups are behind it, but even CEA, the Colorado Educational Association Teachers Union, they've not given very much money relative to what they usually give for elections. There's actually been kind of a schism on the left about this. A lot of people on the left don't like the fact that it raises sales tax, which they say is regressive on the poorest, and simply raises the flat income tax rather than reinstating the state's graduated income tax, which they see as more just.
Which we haven't had since the mid-'80s.
1987. And so in some ways there's a little bit of, I mean, most of the people on the left are united behind it and basically say, hey, look, we can look at a longer term fix someday, but we have to have a tourniquet to stanch the bleeding here. And that's kind of the argument being made for it. But there's not a lot of money to, you know, build a very big bullhorn.
There's not a lot of money because there's no real coalition. As a guy who fights tax increases, this one didn't seem as huge a threat, because usually it's the chamber who gets all the money in, and then it's the CEA or some other union organization that brings in the foot soldiers, and then you have somebody like Hickenlooper as the mouthpiece, and that has worked very well for boondoggles like Fast Tracks, where Hickenlooper ran, you know, wrote on the lines for the commercials, A through I, where he walked around with Sesame Street characters selling the Tabor, or C, where he fell out of an airplane. I mean, all these things, he took a lead, but you brought in the big money guys who are going to get paid for it, the corporate welfare types, and you got the guys with the Birkenstocks who are going to out there knock on the doors.
Right.
This time, the business guys aren't there at all.
That's because they're gearing up for next year, probably next year. I mean, it's no secret that somebody's looking at some sort of rewrite of Tabor or a tax increase. Yeah, but it's
serious.
It's for real. It's
going to be very hard, assuming this goes down, and I think it's going to go down. Nobody can tell because it hasn't.
There's no polls out there because
nobody's
got
even the
money
Denver
to poll.
Post, who used to do polling, hasn't polled this yet. Are you going to?
I doubt it. Polling costs a lot of money, and typically when you poll, you poll on a bunch of issues and many candidates, and with one ballot issue, you know, it's
the Post used
who's
to
even
do
a
this.
likely voter this year?
Yeah.
I mean, who's gonna return these ballots? You know.
One of the interesting things, some of the dynamics, is one, we're sending out these ballots like grocery store coupons, so nobody has to go and vote. They're showing up on the doorstep, which might get more voter turnout, which I think is going to be bad for this tax increase, because I think most people are concerned about employment, and this is not going to help employment. But the thing that helps them is the election is a week earlier than most elections. It is the first day of November, so people who wait too long, their vote won't count.
True. Yes, and just to point out again, in an all, mail ballot situation, we still are trying to get a hold of what the voting cycle is. Especially in an off year like this, what are people doing? Even
though in an on year, an even year, We don't have election day, we have election month, because
Right.
more and more people are doing absentee ballots and getting them in mass. And so if you're not winning a month ahead, you're not winning.
Right, and it's completely changed the advertising cycle. And for us, we have to push out stories, looking at the big issue earlier and
Let's
maybe
be
do
honest.
more of them.
Even though both papers here have touched on it, television has really left this issue alone. It hasn't really gone very far, and even the newspapers really haven't covered it because it's a boring issue. Why hasn't this ignited? We've only got about a minute here.
I don't know. We spend all our time talking about taxes. The story about schools being underfunded or Colorado being overtaxed or however you want to look at it, I mean, that's common. We hear about that over and over. And I think you're right. There's no money behind it. There's no coalition behind it. The big guys aren't talking about it. The interesting question for me is, what do the voters do when the big guys are kind of downplaying it and pretending it doesn't exist?
That's actually really disappointing. Even bigger than his problem with the protesters, Hickenlooper's, I'm not weighing in on it. That's not the kind of leadership I expected from him. He won't endorse it, but why doesn't he come out and say, no, I'm not voting for it?
We've asked him that, and he basically said, I told people I wouldn't take sides on it, which seems an almost impossible thing to promise as governor. But he did, although I will say something to circle back to our earlier note about what might happen next year, which is he said, I won't take a position on a tax increase in my first year.
Yeah, I noticed that. And nobody sells them like Hick does. Joe, thank you. Tim, thank you.
Thanks,
Listen
John.
for me late nights on 850 KOA. Tell a friend, and we'll see you next week. That goes by quickly.
Yeah.
It does.
Especially
Actually,
when
I
you're talking
thought
about